This is going to be a short discussion on tips of how to attend a 40k tournament, hopefully some helpful advice for people who have never gone, and a refresher of the basics for those of us who regularly go to tournaments. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we like to get the best out of our miniatures on the battlefield, and today we want to get the best out of them in organised tournament events. In this video we'll be talking mainly about the practicalities and general ideas you want to have in mind while attending a tournament, rather than an out and out tournament strategy video, although I'd certainly be up for doing one of those at a later date. So 40k tournaments are probably the most common sort of organised event, where people gather for an entire day of gaming with some sort of big overarching structure to it. The smaller ones tend to be held in local gaming shops, places where they have a decent amount of table space available, and the large ones tend to be held at custom venues, often hired out specifically for the event of that tournament. It will typically cost some money to attend for the organisation and the prize pool, and for that you can usually expect 3 games of 40k in a day against randomly drawn opponents, competing to win the most games and potentially win some prizes. I know full well that tournaments and competitive play are just one side of the hobby. A lot of people don't have all that much interest in attending tournaments for various reasons, but I have to admit I really enjoy tournaments myself, otherwise I'd probably not be making a Model Soldiers Tactics channel. For me, the main advantage of playing in a 40k tournament is that you get a full day of gaming in, against a variety of different armies, likely new opponents. In tournaments it's generally accepted that most people will be trying to bring the strongest army that the rules allow them, so it's quite good fun to test the strongest things that your army can do without having to worry about potentially playing too strong a list in a casual game. You get to see a lot of cool armies that other people have brought, often some spectacular painting. You get to meet new people and catch up with other people who also attend the events regularly. And of course you have the chance to win prizes, although I'd never go to a tournament hell-bent on winning anything. If the entertainment for the day isn't worth the entry fee, then you probably shouldn't go. There are some drawbacks to going to tournaments. They'll often be not the easiest to get to, depending on where you live and what transport options you have available, so that might limit your range in what you can attend a bit. Some people just don't enjoy playing optimised armies that don't fit the fluff, or just enjoy having a more chilled out game of 40k in general, without the rules and tactics necessarily being the main focus of the game. Having said all of that, I still really enjoy organised competitive events, and I think they're a great thing for a hobby as the whole. So the first step in attending a tournament is to choose which one you're going to be going for. Various factors will feed into that, including where it is, how much it costs, what day it's on, and sometimes the format of the event, such as if you prefer ITC missions, or if you prefer games with a certain points limit. It depends a bit on how early you'd have to sign up. Some of the most popular events have their tickets sell out in anywhere between minutes and a few days. Others, often more local events, you'll sometimes literally be able to buy a ticket the night before and have the flexibility of whether or not you're able to turn up. Usually if I've committed to an event, I'll tend to buy the ticket as early as possible to ensure there's still spaces left. Usually most tournaments do have decent refund policies for people who can't go, provided they tell them with reasonable notice so they can give the ticket to someone else. I've frequently had tournaments that I've had to drop out on because of work or other commitments, and so far I've always got my money back. Once you've selected a tournament, I'd read the rules pack. It'll tell you your army requirements, which could be anything between 1,000 and 2,000, although typically 2,000 points tends to be the going standard for most tournaments. There'll usually be the normal organised play special rules, such as the rule of 3, and all of the other stuff from the latest chapter approved. The tournament might also have its own restrictions, like some events that limit you to 1 codex, or have focuses on tanks or troops, or are Highlander events with only 1 or 2 units of each type allowed. So have a good read over it and make sure there's nothing weird in the army construction that's going to get in the way of your army. You also want to have a look at the missions, and there are various different formats for this. A lot of local tournaments will either just use the standard rulebook missions with some extra bits and bobs attached, or maybe changed in subtle ways, or they might be using the ITC or ETC mission packs. In particular, ITC seems to be on the rise in a lot of competitive events worldwide. It's the mission pack run by Frontline Gaming that tries to go out of its way to make the game more fair, more balanced, and run as smoothly as possible. Although some people may debate how well they manage with this. I quite like it. Maybe it's another subject for another video at a later date. The tournament will usually have a scoring system, whether it's ITC via the Best Coast Pairings app, or the common 20-0 system seen in things like ETC, where depending on your victory point differential, you and your opponent will gain a share of 20 victory points depending on how close the game was. Depending on the event, there may be points for non-gaming related things, such as submitting your army list on time, having painted armies or exceptionally well painted armies that get nominated for best painted, and things like sportsmanship and keeping to time. The event usually will have specific painting requirements, either something like 3 colours minimum, which is saying that your army must have been painted with at least 3 different colours on various parts of your model, such as a Space Marine that's painted blue with a black gun and silver bits for the metal. Or some events might say that the entire army has to be painted to a battle-ready standard and based, for example. Not everywhere does this. A lot of places are happy for you to play with grey plastic, though sometimes it may cost you some of the points in the final scores that let you know who's won the tournament. The next step after looking at the rules pack is to choose your army list. It's usually worth picking a list that's quite tailored to the missions and the army requirements. For example, if you're playing a lot of missions that have kill points in them, then it's probably best not to take an army with 40 individual units, as you might well auto lose every game. Similarly, some units aren't as strong in ITC as others, particularly things that can give up secondaries very easily. Again, that's a whole nother video, but my general advice would be to build an army list to the missions and individual event if you have the opportunity to, rather than just using the exact same units for each event that you attend. If you want to maximise your chance of doing well at the tournament, it's well worth getting a fair bit of practice in with the list that you've chosen. It'll help you know how these exact set of units work together, might highlight some weaknesses that you have in matchups and how you might be able to mitigate them. And if you have the opportunity to, it's worth running through some of the exact scenarios that you're going to be playing in the tournament, so when it comes to that mission that you play in the tournament, you will know exactly what you're doing, and it should be very familiar to you on the day. When it comes to actually packing for your tournament, there's quite a big kit list of things that you'll need. Firstly, your miniatures and a safe way to transport them. If possible, it's best to do as much organising as you can before the games. If you can store them in individual squads, then that's great. Or otherwise, maybe just make sure that you arrive a little bit early to give yourself time to unpack and set things straight. This really cuts down on the amount of time that you might waste in the first game as you very slowly unpack a large army. Don't forget to bring your army list, ideally printed if possible, but written out legibly and clearly. Often the individual events will have a specific format that you need to follow for this, so check this in the rules pack. In particular, some events might say that you do or don't need to declare warlord traits and psychic powers before the game, or whether they're things that you can tailor to your opponent, so give the rules pack a good read. A lot of events use the Best Coast Pairings app, which is a matching app where you submit your lists beforehand, and then this automatically runs the tournament, pairing people who have the same amount of points against each other. So the winners play the winners, so you should be playing people who are most on your level throughout the day. This one usually needs for you to sign up and submit your list to it before the event begins. So if you have to do that, make sure it's done with a fair bit before the event, as you don't really want to be trying to learn how to use it on the day. Next, you'll need your rule books, so that you can access them if any rules disputes manifest, or if you can't remember a certain stat for a certain model. 40k has far too many numbers and variables to remember all of them, so having your rulebooks to hand, or at least a digital copy of the rules, is an absolute must. In addition to this, I would try and have a copy of the event's rules pack on you on the day as well, usually just in a digital form on your phone or another device, although some people do like to print it out. If you're able to access this quite quickly, then it can help get games rolling smoothly on the tabletop, rather than having to run around and ask other players or a tournament organiser exactly what's happening in any given mission, or how elements of the scoring work. You should certainly bring snacks and a water bottle. You'd be surprised just how dehydrated you can get in an entire day of standing and chatting with your opponents. Having easy access to water is very nice, and having a few snacks around might make it easier if you don't need to go and buy things when you get hungry. I'd usually try and take a pen and some scrap paper of some sort. Sometimes this is just the easiest way for remembering things such as objectives, counting kill points, noting down your chosen psychic powers, that sort of thing. It's also good to have a bit of super glue on standby as well, just in case something key gets snapped early on in the day. Ideally you don't want to be playing with damaged miniatures in the next couple of games, so being able to make an easy repair or two on the fly can certainly come in handy. Though it might be that other people also have a bit spare if you ask them. A lot of people use army trays to get their miniatures from A to B. I tend to just transport them in and out of the boxes, because the way I store them is very easy to get in and out of. but if you're using fancier storage with foam trays and things, it's usually just going to be easier to transport the miniatures on a tray from one table to the next, and it can also be handy for setting them up for things like army painting, judging and things. If you do want to try and maximise the amount of time that you're playing games rather than looking up rules, it's sometimes worth making a quick cheat sheet for the missions or some other key stats that your miniatures have. Particularly if there's a table that you have to roll on, that you always have to look up the results, it might be easy just to put that and any other things that aren't a pain to remember on one sheet of A4 paper, rather than having to leaf through your books for every single one. I find the core rulebook deployment types can be a good one to include on this as well, just because I can never remember which order they're in, and I almost always have to get out my big rulebook to check which map is the map that we've just rolled for. On the actual day, it's generally best to arrive with a little bit of spare time, rather than at the last second that you possibly could, just so you have enough time to get your army out, register with the tournament organiser if you need to do that, and chat to any other players who are about. It's certainly quite impolite to arrive late, as this can really make things difficult for the tournament organiser, and potentially delay games for other competitors. When you come to a game in a tournament, it's good to take a minute or two to have a quick chat with your opponent. After all, it is a social occasion as well as a competition. I wouldn't just get lost in unpacking your army and going straight into the game without acknowledging that you are playing a game with another human being. As well as this though, it is worth having a quick chat about anything that's unclear in the rules before the game, particularly deciding how the terrain on the table will be working, so you don't get halfway through and someone's unclear as to whether this bit actually blocks line of sight, or whether you get a cover save from these particular terrain bits. If there's anything that's particularly confusing about your army, or any surprise moves or gotcha moments that your opponent might be likely to object to, it's often worth running those through quickly as well, just so when you do pull that manoeuvre, they can't say that they weren't warned. During the game itself, it goes without saying to play fair, both to yourself and your opponent, being precise with measurements, doing things in the proper order, and also keeping to a reasonable time, as particularly in a tournament setting, it could drastically change the outcome of the game if you don't get the full 5 or 6 turns in. If you do have any problems for any reason, particularly with rules disputes, you can often ask players on other tables nearby, who might be able to settle the matter, or if that doesn't resolve things, either player can always call over a tournament organiser to make a ruling either way. Once they do, both players should accept their ruling, even if you might disagree at the time. It is their event and they set the rules. Between rounds, I'd make sure that you get decent food, drink, and use the loos, as you're not going to have as much fun if you're halfway through another intense round and you haven't looked after yourself. If you finished a bit early, you can always just chat a bit more to your opponent, or maybe have a walk round and look at other people's nicely painted armies in mid-flow of battle, and see how the strongest players are doing duking it out on the top tables. I'd usually try and stay for the results presentation if you can, to see how everything turned out, and if you've enjoyed the event, it's nice to let the tournament organiser know as well, as they'll be putting in a lot of work to organise all of these events, and they're usually not doing it because they're earning any significant amount of money out of the day. Overall though, the biggest tip is to have a good time. Really, when you're attending a tournament, it doesn't really matter who wins and loses. The main thing that you can expect out of the day are 3 decent games against strong armies. Sometimes you'll do well, sometimes you'll make some bad decisions, and sometimes the dice will just screw you over. Either way, the main advice that I'd give is just to relax and have a good time. After all, if you're not, then there's not really any point in going in the first place. I'm sure that this isn't a complete list by any stretch of the imagination. If you can think of any good tips for attending tournaments, please let me know down in the comments below. I've tried to give a bit of a general overview here, but it's definitely a subject where there's so much more to say. At some point in the future, I'll certainly look to do a more focused video on aiming to win more games at tournaments and the various ways that you can think about trying to improve your play. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe. We have regular 40k tactics content every single day. I do have a Patreon page, so if anyone is interested in helping support the channel, then there's a link in the description below. Any support is appreciated if you're watching regularly, as these videos do take quite a long time to make. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys in the next episode.